All right. It looks like we're in the right place at the right time. And I want to welcome everybody. It's a new year, but it's the same show. It's Nomberg Law Live every Tuesday at 10 o'clock Central. Gosh, we've done about 230, 240 shows. And I could not be more pleased with my guest who is currently with me today. You guys know him. He is a such noted sports writer for many years, Ivan Maisel. Good morning, Ivan. And again, Happy New Year to you.
Good morning. Happy New Year. Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, certainly. I'm so glad that we're having a few minutes to talk. We've got a few preliminary things to talk about, notably college football, but that's not why, specifically why I asked you a few months ago to come on the show. But for those of you who may not know Ivan, then that means that you haven't followed college football in the last 30 years. He's been with Sports Illustrated, ESPN, but he's now with On3 Media. And if you would, Ivan, tell folks who may not be familiar, and I'm going to put a link to the website in the show notes. Tell us about On3. What is that format? What's going on there?
On3 is a startup. We turned the lights on August 1st, right before the season began. We cover recruiting heavily. We have either purchased or have operating agreements with a couple of dozen team sites, and we're getting more every week, it feels like. And we cover college sports, and what I do has nothing to do with recruiting or the team sites. I just do what I've done since the 80s, which is tell stories about college football, and I'm doing it now with these guys. And I honestly, I'm really kind of a carnival barker, to get people to come look at the site, which I'm happy to do. It's a terrific site, and the recruiting analysts we have are very good. And I know a lot of college football fans, especially in the South, are recruiting nuts, and we've hired the best. And I hope people check it out. It's On3, like when you break a huddle, on3.com.
Well, as I said, I put a link in the show notes. You guys should check it out. I have spent quite a bit of time checking out the awesome writing. But speaking of the Deep South and football, for those of you who don't know, Ivan is originally from Mobile, Murphy High School, who also have notable graduates for governor, NASA astronauts, and a host of professional athletes. Now, here's my question for you, Ivan. Out of your class or classes that came through, who were the most notable from a professional standpoint from sports that people might recognize that maybe you were in school with?
Well, since you brought up the NASA astronaut, Kay Heyer was in my class, 1977, as was Marty McDowell, who went on to be an All-American wide receiver at Mississippi State and then played for the Vikings for a few years. The Keith McCants played at Alabama. Had a terrific career for the university.
Yeah. If you guys ever want to do a deep dive of Murphy High School, you will spend a long time looking at the notable graduates, particularly in the world of sports. But you go from Mobile to Stanford and I know you don't want to go through your career, but one of the things that I've always admired is your style of writing. And I guess my question to you is, Ivan, clearly you have the love of sports, not just what happens particularly on the field. We can all read the scoreboard and read the box scores, but it's all the stuff around the game. And I guess my question is, how did you either develop that love of writing, or did you have certain mentors or other writers who really inspired you that kind of set you down certain paths? I'm sure you've had many mentors along the way, but where did it start from?
Well, I grew up, in Mobile in the 60s during, the height of Alabama, Bear Bryant's first dominant reign at the university. I grew up when, I was in first grade when the Braves moved to Atlanta, and, what a big deal that was throughout the Southeast. I grew up in a household where I literally learned to read by reading the sporting news. It came every week. So I was just eating up with it. My older brother collected baseball cards, so I did. And I, and then I just like to read and put the two together. I had in high school, I had a teacher at Murphy who convinced me I had some writing talent. And so I dived in when I got to college, and there, you talk about mentors, Dan Jenkins, who was, the best ever. His daughter, Sally, who is the best ever of my generation, and I worked together at the Stanford Daily. So Dan, I knew Dan from the time I was about 18 years old until he died 2 years ago. And he was a mentor. So many of those great guys at Sports Illustrated, Steve Wolf, Ron Femright, guys that really meant a lot to me as a young cub reporter and for a very long time.
Briefly about Dan Jenkins, his books for the time that they were written were quite, this is my term, irreverent from a sports standpoint, because they and not knowing the man personally, here's my question, was his personality similar to the way that he wrote?
Yes.
And that's got to be rare. That's, I don't know how many people can just take the way that they feel, the way that they act, and then just put it on paper. But he seemed, having never met the man, it just seemed like that was his style, and that's what was so appealing to so many.
Dan had an unshakable self-confidence in his opinion, and that came through. Because he took some pretty fearless stands for the day, and fearless in their irreverence, and torqued off a lot of people. But it was always entertaining, and it was always rooted in fact. He was a stickler to get it right, and those two lessons, that self-confidence and that belief in reporting, were great bumpers for me to stay between.
I would have no doubt. I bet that was sometimes it was probably a treat, but other times I'm sure it was head scratching on for you figuring your path from a standpoint, your voice, if you will. But Ivan, I know that in the last several months you had, or I guess it was earlier this fall, you penned a book and published a book that you never wanted to write. No parent ever wants to write about. And that's where you and I intersected a few months ago at Jake's bookstore here in Birmingham. You had a signing, and having lost your son in the spring or winter of 2015, Max, I know that's what led us together. I keep trying to catch his eye, and I know that from reading this book, and as I told you, I read it in one sitting, having suffered grief as every person goes through it at some point or another, but your book just spoke to me, and that's why I spoke with you. I don't even know where to begin at some point, Max, but I know Ivan, with you being a writer, did you find comfort before you even intended to write this book? Were you putting your feelings on paper, so to speak, before it got to the point where you decided you wanted to publish a book?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And in fact, as someone, honestly, that was not very good at saying my feelings out loud, what I did, and especially in those early days and weeks after Max died, disappeared and then died, and we didn't recover his body for 8 weeks. I would wake up most mornings and just type into my laptop just to get it out of my system. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, they weren't even sentences. I couldn't even, my mind wouldn't stay still long enough to think a sentence. They were just fragments of thoughts, and eventually it was just a way for me to excavate what I was feeling out. And, the one thing I learned about grief, more important than anything else, honestly, is that you have to grieve. And this was my method. Other people might cry every day, and other people might, take on a project or whatever they have to do. This was my way, was just get it out and get it into my laptop.
it's one of the things that I too have learned over the years, that everybody grieves differently, and there's no way to tell a person how to grieve. They just have to figure it out for themselves. But what you
Yes.
just said was so very important, that you have to go through the process, because if not, you're stuck. And I
Yeah.
don't want to jump around, but there's a passage very briefly I want to read that I think sums this up, and that's why I want to talk about this. You wrote, "If Max's death has taught me anything, it's that life doesn't allow you to remain anchored anywhere. We keep moving, even when all we want to do is remain in a moment, return to a crossroads, undo a regret, say something that we would have changed where we stand today." And of the entire book, I think that's the quote or the passage that spoke to me the very most. And at the beginning of the of your grieving process, did you realize that, or is it something that took time to come to realize?
Oh no, that I think I came to that conclusion about 3 years after Max died. The book is it's not terribly thick, but it represents a long time of living and experiencing and learning how to deal with this. One thing my wife Meg said early on is that it's not something that we're going to get over or get through. You have to learn to live with it, and I live with it to this day. You carry your grief with you, but you have to carry it. You can't stay where I can't stay where Max was. As tempting as that was at the moment, you understand that if you don't move on, then you lose again. You lose all those experiences that you might otherwise have, and what good does that do? So it's a terrible decision to make, but trying to stay back where Max was not going to change anything. He was still going to be dead, and you have to move on.
You never, obviously, well, not obviously, but you never forget, but you have to evolve. And another thing that I have heard you say is grief is love. And that's as powerful of a comment as you can make about the situation. But I know that you and Meg, your wife, you grieved in such different ways. You write that she traveled and wanted to know everything, and you dealt with it, I assume, by writing and processing in your own way. And your two daughters, Max's sisters, they had to deal with it in their own way.
Yes, no, and what we said, the first thing Meg and I had to do was agree that, and as you said earlier, and I think one of the most important points I learned in going through this was that everybody grieves differently. And, Meg and I decided early on we were to accommodate each other the way we were going to do it, that we weren't going to judge one another. And we didn't say it in those words, but that's just kind of been our relationship for almost 40 years. And that, as it turned out, is is one of the keys to surviving this tragedy. That there is a statistic out there that the death of a child ends about half the marriages that it affects. And what David Kessler, who is a leading expert on grief, said, it's not the death per se, it's the fact that the spouses judge one another's grief. Why are you crying all the time? Why aren't you crying all the time? Why don't you go to the cemetery, or whatever it is? And we just decided early on we weren't going to do that. And all we could really say to the girls was, is grieve. And I said to them a lot, I don't care what you do, I don't care how you do it, but you have to do it. And I can't, our girls were looking at us and going, oh my God, they lost a child. and Meg and I are looking at them and saying, oh my God, they lost a brother. Meg and I are in our early 60s, and between us, we have 9 siblings who are all still alive. So I can't, it's really hard for me to imagine something like that happening to our girls, but it did. And we just said to them, do whatever it is you need to do. If it's go to a counselor, if it's quit your job and howl at the moon, but if you don't control how it comes out of you, then it will control when it comes out of you. And that may not be convenient to the rest of your life. And I think they heard us. They did it differently from one another and differently from us, but I think they heard us.
Yeah, it's the journey. It's the path. It's whatever it is. It's just, you got to keep moving forward. And for those who are just joining us or may catch us later on YouTube or on the replay, I'm talking with sportswriter Ivan Maisel, and we're speaking about his son Max and the memoir that Ivan published this past year. And I put a link to the book as well. Ivan, can we spend a few minutes talking about Max?
Sure.
And your book, in one regard, to me, is almost I don't know if this is the proper term, but it's a love letter to Max. It's not all roses, because life isn't that way. You were very raw. It was very brave to me, the way you presented the book. Not many people would share what you shared. And I think it takes an incredible inner strength for you and for the family to do that. But maybe part of that was your grieving process as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And the strength of the family was just in allowing me to write the book without raising any objections, but they understood this is just kind of how I grieved. My thought about being honest was just that suicide comes with so much societal baggage. And I didn't want anybody to think I was hiding anything about Max, because I thought that would be interpreted as shame, given the fact that he ended his life. And we weren't ashamed of Max. He was sick. And mental illness can be obviously as deadly, as insidious as cancer. And I just decided I was going to be open about it. And once I decided to be open about him, I decided I had to be open about me and him. And it just sort of all flowed from that. And really, at the end of the day, what difference did it make? Whatever, however I might be criticized, either for being open or for the way I parented him or whatever, my neglect at times, it was, that the pain of that wasn't going to compare to to losing him. So that, I just decided I was going to put it all out there and let people see for themselves.
Well, it really showed how a family deals with mental illness. It shows how a family deals with depression. It shows how a family deals with the loss of a child. And people can have opinions, but we all know what good those are. But it's unfair for someone to criticize. And I'm not saying that I know of anyone, I'm just saying in general, to criticize how two people parent their children or deal with their children's medical conditions, because there's no way to give you, here's the playbook. It's not like Coach Saban handing you a playbook and say, here's what we do.
Yeah. And especially with mental illness, which is, there's no x-ray that shows you anything. There's no MRI that shows you anything. And, we listened to the experts as best we could, and we made the best decisions we knew how to make. And don't, I haven't received any criticism about, well, that's not true. I've received virtually no criticism about anything in the book pertaining to my parenting. But at the time I was trying to, deciding what to write. That's what kind of went through my head. And, there are things I wish I had done differently with Max, and I write that in the book. The shame of it and the sadness of it is, in any interpersonal relationship, you screw up and you have the opportunity to make amends. And in this one, I don't. That's just, it's just something I have to live with.
It is. But one of the things that I really, really enjoyed about the book is you sharing Max's interests and his love of photography and his willingness to share a little bit of that with the family, maybe at numerous requests, maybe not necessarily with him coming forward voluntarily, but to let you into that world, I suspect was a real treat as a parent at times. And share, if you will, this is where I want to learn a little bit more about Max, is his love of photography and what he saw through that lens that maybe gave the outside world a share of, or a glimpse of who he was.
Well, sure. Max was painfully shy and just most usually reticent to say anything in public. And part of that was he was somewhere on the spectrum, and we never got, that was about as precise a diagnosis as we ever got. He was definitely not autistic. He didn't have what used to be called Asperger's. But there, he was just wired a little differently. And so he had trouble in direct personal communication, especially with his peers. And he was a lonely kid in a lot of ways, but he latched on to photography. We had bought a couple of prints of a photographer that he liked, and he had met the photographer, and that piqued his interest. And so when he was probably in his mid-teens, he began to take photos, and wouldn't take pictures of people, but he would take pictures of nature and of architecture and anything that, any shape or vision that caught his eye. That's what he loved to do. And that was how he communicated. And it was funny, just the fact that he hated to have his picture taken. He didn't like to take pictures of people, and he hated to have his picture taken. And the title of the book comes from that. The wallpaper on my phone, which I don't know if you can see here, the
picture in the book.
Yeah. So the two girls are looking right at the camera, and Max is looking up and away. And I was looking at my wallpaper a couple of years ago, and it was actually now close to 4 years ago. And I'm like, look at me.
Yeah.
So I keep trying to catch his eye.
And from this life experience, how do I phrase this? When we lose somebody who's that close to us, at least for my experience, and I'm not speaking for others, it almost shifted priorities or had me refocus what was truly the important things in life. As much as we want to claim that college sports are so very important, now, granted, culturally in the South, they're incredibly important as a whole. But for an individual basis, it's a sport, it's an activity, it's a way of getting you away from other things. My question, Ivan, is, and please don't take this the wrong way, because I know this is your profession, is writing about sports. I'm not saying that. But from a personal standpoint, did it create a shift in certain priorities for you from a personal standpoint? What was important to you? Who was important to you? those types of things. Did that have an impact on you, the loss of Max?
No question. No question. I used to get so emotionally wrapped up in my work that I would get so hyped up about it. I didn't write very well. It's just, the bigger the event, the worse I was, at least in my own mind. I go back and read some things that I thought were terrible now, and they were fine. But I would just get too cranked up, if it was a big game. And it would take me forever to write. After Max died, the games they're just not as important anymore. And that may be a function of age too, but especially after Max died, they're not as important to me as they were. And oddly enough, it's made me a better writer because I don't take, I view them a lot less emotionally and a lot more clinically. And my shortcut to figuring out the angle I want to take in any given story is a lot faster than it used to be. So in that sense, I really struggled with the idea that it made me a better writer, that I was somehow benefiting from Max having died. That really bothered me. But I finally just came to the conclusion that you grow from the experiences you have, and to not do that would, be silly.
Well, it goes back to what you said in the book about staying in that place as opposed to keeping moving forward. It probably made you a better person in some way, it made you a better writer, it made you a better father.
No question.
And it's not a criticism of you whatsoever. I'm just speaking from personal experience that I guess it refined many things, or does that for many people. And one of the other things I wanted to ask, if you and your wife Meg shared this experience, you have so many people in your life who love you, you have so many people who've supported you, and I know you count your blessings from that standpoint. But did you ever get, or do you get to a point where you feel like maybe you're grief counseling the people who are trying to grief counsel you? And that's a bad term. They want to bring support to you, but you find that the roles have become almost reversed at times. I don't know if I'm properly describing that.
No, well, and that happened more in the early days, and it's really what's the word? Discomforting. It's from our angle anyway. Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, the COO of Facebook, wrote a remarkable book with Adam Grant, who was a best-selling author and a professor at Penn. And the book is called Option B, and it's about grief and about picking up and moving on. Cheryl's husband died suddenly of a heart attack a few years ago, right around when Max died, and they had two small children. And they came up, and I don't know if it originated with them. It was the first place I saw it, with the ring theory of grief, which is, in the middle is the immediate family of whoever died. And then on the first ring may be, their siblings and close friends. And then the next ring is friends who aren't as close, and so forth. And the ring theory is you comfort in and you ask for comfort out. So if somebody is is not as close, you can ask for comfort for them, but you can't ask for comfort for somebody who's inside, who's closer to the death, to the deceased than you are. And that made a lot of sense to us. And it sort of helped us negotiate who we were, what little sustenance and resources. We didn't have a lot of sustenance for anybody looking for sustenance from us because of Max died. That well was dry. We did the best we could to prop each other up, but it's hard, and people don't know what to say, and they don't know how to comfort. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. Just not as a how-to guide, but just to say, this is what this was like. And if you live long enough, you are going to have to go through maybe not something this tragic, but you are going to grieve. And you need to know this is what this was like. And that's the phrase I had was being a docent through my grief. And I think, people don't want to read about grief. And the book is so much more than that, I think. In terms of, it's not, obviously there's many sad parts, but there's also warm parts and funny parts. And it's just kind of what our life, my life was like for those 6 years after Max died.
Well, Ivan, I could talk to you for the next 2 hours. About Max, about your experiences, but I want to be mindful of your time. I want to be mindful of you and everything that you've gone through. But I do want to especially thank you for your bravery. I want to thank you for your ability to share your family story, Max's story, because I think it's a very important book for any person, not just those who have dealt with loss, but for many other reasons. So thank you, sir, for spending time with me today, and more importantly, for doing what you've done.
Well, thank you. Let me say two things about that. One about that anyway, is that bravery to me always entails like having a choice. You can be brave about something or not. And I didn't feel like any of this was a choice. This was just, as I said, this is what happened in my life, and I just had to respond. But people are scared of grief, and in that sense, as I said, I was hoping that writing this would make them a little less scared of it, because at the end of the day, grief is love. It's the form our love takes for the person that we lost. And that thought really helped me. The other story I wanted to tell you, which I forgot when you were asking me about Max and photography, is the photo on the cover was a self-portrait Max took. He was given an assignment at a class in college. He was a photography major, to take a photo for the book flap of a book of his photography. And this was the author photo. It wasn't the photo like, is on every book jacket, including this one of me. But that was Max. He would not, he didn't show, he didn't want to show his face. And the great thing about putting this on the cover to me was that, one, I feel like we completed the assignment. It is on a book jacket. And two, he's now officially a published photographer. So, and there are a couple of photos of his in the book as well, but that one, the cover photo is a self-portrait.
Well, as I said earlier, I put in the show notes for anybody who is interested in reading Ivan's book. There's a clickable link there that you can read about it and purchase it. But Ivan, again, thank you for spending some time with me today on such a important subject. On a lesser, well, certainly. I can't let you get out of here. I'm not going to ask you for a prediction for Monday night. I want to ask you, what should the casual fan or even the astute fan be really on the lookout for? What's something within the game that you look for that might be of interest in the game? I'm not talking about the score. I'm talking about the game within the game. What's something that catches your eye that you may be looking for?
Well, if you think back to the SEC championship game in Atlanta, Alabama broke Georgia apart by throwing behind them. Jamison Williams just got behind the secondary and broke the back of the defense. You have to think Georgia will be aware of that. And so then the question becomes, can a healthy Brian Robinson, make the Alabama running game effective against the Georgia defensive front, which stopped everybody else from running, and didn't do such a great job stopping either phase against Alabama. And, on the other side of the ball, we still, as great a game as Stetson Bennett had, last Friday against Michigan, what's he going to do against an Alabama defense that bottled him up? And, if Georgia falls behind, can Bennett bring them back? And, to me, those are the big questions.
Well, I know it's a hot ticket. It's going to be a interesting game. And I know that it's a sport that you so love and have written so eloquently about for many, many years. But Ivan, thank you again for your time today. And as I tell you guys every week that we do the show, it's interesting conversations with people in their areas of expertise. Unfortunately, this is not an area of expertise that Ivan wanted to find himself in, but he has done a beautiful job of presenting it and sharing time with us today. So thank you again, Ivan. And guys, y'all continue to be safe. Each Tuesday at 10 o'clock Central, Nomberg Law Live. Happy New Year to everybody, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.